Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of politics and civics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. We've got another guest on the show, as you can see. And when I have guests on the show, I always give the disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against the guest's political views or groups they support. But the nature of today's topic makes that a non-issue. And that's how to find common ground in politics. Conflict is, unfortunately, what sells in politics and media in general. The more divisive, loud, and obnoxious you are, the more engagement you get. With all the bickering and fighting we do, it can seem like an endless cycle of strife and can feel suffocating, like there's no way around it, like we just can't find common ground. But we can find common ground. We have more shared values than we realize. I believe that, and so does my guest, Nathan Smolensky. Nathan has a fairly eclectic professional background, including writing and editing marketing copy, overseeing databases, leading nonprofit boards, and even chess instruction. In the political realm, he used to be the state director for the Florida Forward Party, and just recently he became the self-published author of the book titled Common Ground from the Ground Up, How Rethinking Politics Can Help Us Feel Heard, Heal Relationships, and Fix Our Democracy. Right there's the book. So let's get into this book and some actionable tips he has for how we can all do better in finding common ground and fixing our broken dialogue. Please welcome Nathan Smolensky to the show. Nathan, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great.
Fantastic. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So I noted in the intro that a lot of your background actually isn't in the political realm. You have some experience, of course. Most of my guests are typically more ingrained in politics in some way. So what brought you into the political arena?
So there's a few elements to that. Some of, what may be seen as, oh, I'm doing a lot of non-politics. It's because within the independent space in particular, opportunities are a little more limited. And if I'm doing something as a volunteer or in volunteer capacity, I like to say I was usually sunlighting during those times as something else. And my professional background, my education is in marketing, messaging and communications. This was not always something that I was able to apply to politics or had the opportunity to apply to politics. And over time, I came to realize how much I was missing out because I do, and I think quite a lot of people do seek out that sense of purpose, that sense of doing something positive with their skills, doing something positive with their life, and that sense of I can contribute something within the political arena is something that I came to adopt a little more after 2016. Not that my foray was a reaction against Trump necessarily in his first election, but that moment of, hey, this sort of style of politics that I had some concerns about that seemed to be working better and better and that people around me were kind of underestimating, that was a point of validation. And I was saying, all right, this is getting more and more divided, and there's a need for a counterbalance, for something more unifying within our political realm. And it has continued to be somewhat divisive since then. I don't know if you've noticed that, but
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a little while, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to dedicate more and more of my time and my energy to politics. Obviously, when it comes to education in particular, when it comes to promoting chess, this is something that I'm also close to and still very much passionate about, but that is just one issue that I care about. And one of the things I touch on in the book is whatever issue it is that's important to you, having a functional conversation, having a healthy discourse allows you to share your voice, share your thoughts on that issue much more effectively. So some of the work I do is ultimately in service of, well, I want to be part of the conversation too. And I know so many people who want to be part of that healthy conversation and share their voices. So there's a little of that in there as well.
Yeah, obviously the whole fostering dialogue, that's a big part of the book. And we're of course going to go into that, but that's one of the big things for me too, is just I had to learn a lot of those skills throughout college and even since then, and trying to refine it over time. And
Sure.
sometimes it could seem easier, or it can seem like you know how to have a conversation with people, but you really figure out, oh, actually, I didn't really know as much as I thought I did. And to the point that you had at the beginning about, it's seeming like there's not a whole lot of nonpartisan avenues. I've felt that way a lot too, and that's partly kind of why I've just tried to forge my own path here, is just try to create something fairly new. And yeah, it can feel like there's just you either got to pick a side or you just got to stay out of it. And a lot of people unfortunately do stay out of it, but
Yeah.
we're hopefully going to be fixing that soon. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Just echoing that. So,
Yeah. So let's get a little bit more into that political foray for you, the more concrete foray you had. So, like I said in the intro, you were recently the director of the Florida Forward Party for 3 years. And of course, talked about it before the show. Always appreciate meeting another either fellow Floridian or somebody who spent a lot of time in Florida through the civics work of mine. How were you involved in the formation of that party, or were you involved in that formation of that party? And and
uh,
and for people who don't know what the Forward Party is about, can you tell people what exactly it is, and why did you feel the work of the Forward Party was necessary?
so the Forward Party the original Forward Party, which I did join shortly after its founding in 2021, was started by Andrew Yang, and it was taking a non-duopoly approach to politics. It's trying to create a viable alternative to the two major parties. And there were two other organizations that it merged with very similar goals in mind. Andrew Yang's organization had a little more of a progressive or a Democrat leaning background. The Renew America movement was a lot of conservatives who were not happy with Trump. And then the Serve America movement is your standard, what you might think of a little more as centrists, and they were a little more of a lobbying group. And the three of them combined formed the Forward Party. The Florida chapter became one of the first official parties within the network by virtue of Florida's laws around party creation, which were a little more welcoming and didn't have quite the gaps, the weights that other states have. So I was involved from a technical point with the creation of the Florida Forward Party as its state director, and that was founded in 2023. So it is a legal party that you can now join. As far as its work of being a vehicle for non-duopoly candidates to credibly challenge those in office and to credibly, in some cases, these are incumbents in nonpartisan positions who are being challenged by more partisan, more divisive voices. There were definitely some limitations to what the Forward Party was well positioned to do. And this is something that I talk about quite a bit in the book, I do think that forging a better politics goes hand in hand with empowering new voices within our political arena. If you have two parties, no other options, zero sum, it lends itself a lot and it creates these incentives of very negative politicking, very divisive politicking. And that's something that Forward and other organizations can play a role in working against.
I always try to not give any opinions one way or another about particular groups, but I think I could still say, even without doing that, that having more choices is usually it's better to have more choices than fewer. But it is interesting. You kind of lampshade it a little bit, but for those at home, the state of Florida actually has it's actually much easier to make a third party than for a lot of other states. You have what are called ballot qualified parties, where they have to reach some sort of criteria where they can actually run candidates under their banner. And Florida is actually a lot easier to do that. For so actually, I'll then ask you. So, did the Forward Party, were they able to actually field any particular candidates, or is it more just a general movement to just bring people under the umbrella, kind of build it up first, and then maybe put somebody out later on?
There was some difficulty around that. So, what we were able to do is endorse candidates. We could not effectively field candidates in partisan races because while you can found the party very quickly, what Florida makes it very difficult to do is to run under a different party or to change your party. Florida has a red shirt year for politicians who change parties. If you change your party, it has to be a full calendar year before the start of the qualifying cycle for the election. So by the time the party was founded in April of 2023, that's already too late for any federal candidate to come and join the party and run in the next year. Not that we were super well positioned by that point to field a credible federal candidate, but what we ended up doing is endorsing independents, endorsing some libertarians, endorsing Republicans, Democrats, and just anyone who we felt was aligned with a better kind of politics as we saw them.
I actually forgot about the fact that you need to sit out a calendar year
Yes.
here in Florida. So thank you for the refresher on it. I was still thinking about the whole, voters who change their party. They have to do it 29 days before an election. But yeah, it's that you kind of also. I have a, a, a book I self published a few years ago too about independence and why they have so much
Sure.
difficulty, and a lot of that is a whole ballot access issue that you lampshaded, and it's just it's very onerous to run a third party or independent campaign. And you just showed just a few reasons why that is. So let's move to the book now.
Sure.
So what compelled you to write this book? Was it those experiences with the Florida Forward Party? Was it just the general state of political discussion in America? Have you wanted to write this for a long time? What ultimately spawned this book?
Well, I think those experiences definitely spurred it on. And there was a point of inspiration in particular that I'll call out insofar as I realized that the appeals to the language that we were using, it was still falling, even though it's all about unifying, it's all about this new kind of politics, it's all about this different way of thinking about politics. But the language, the style of our rhetoric was very much in line with political rhetoric these days. Not that it was inflammatory, but that it was geared towards the choir. It was built to energize rather than to reach out, rather than to persuade. And where that left us is in our own little bubble. And you may have experienced this, and I think some listeners who've been in the independent space or the bridging space may have experienced this, that you get this sort of niche political experience where you feel that's a bubble too. And this is all the people who care about the duopoly and depolarization. And these words mean nothing to a great many Americans. And that is the reality. And what I realized within that, more so than, okay, well, we have to change that wording and change that appeal, it was the problem that, or the idea that this was a shared experience among all from the political spectrum, that we all get stuck inside our bubble because of the way we're used to approaching talking about politics, because of the way we're used to interacting with each other. This is what works, to your point, I think, in the intro, where politicians rile up instead of reach out because they know that's
Yep.
what actually gets people to turn out. It's what gets those donors donating. It's what gets those volunteers signing up. And they're not going to have the channels to persuade anyone because the other side isn't listening. And so it works for them. And then for media, uh, again, the other side isn't listening. So they got to rile up. They got to create more urgency, more emergency, and just more emotion. So it's all about energizing their base rather than making any more general appeals. And the problem is when we emulate that, when we talk about politics the way we're used to hearing about politics, it confines us into our bubble. It makes it so much harder for us to reach out. and for us to effectively communicate with different people. And so this was an avenue that I saw to make the appeal to a more common ground approach, to make the appeal to a more collaborative and a more constructive approach to dialogue, because it was not about the moral uh, case for that. It's not about let's be civil, let's be nice to each other. It's about realizing that people are being held back by the way that they talk about politics and the way that they think about politics and the way that they imagine politics. And there is benefit to all of us in uh, in just taking this more common ground approach.
Yeah, that's something I've been trying to work on formulating in my head too, is how to show people that this being willing to the spirit of compromise. You don't necessarily need to actually compromise, but just the very spirit of compromise, actually listening to people, it does benefit you. Problem is, a lot of people, if they think it doesn't benefit them, and that's, you have to find some way to actually make them realize, no, this is actually is good for everybody. The way we're doing it right now is ultimately not going to help you in the long run. But obviously, it's hard to do that with people who are very narrow minded, have their specific, like, no, this is the way things have to be. I have to fight the good fight. And you touched on it with the echo chambers, our own bubbles, is just this. There's some sort of irony in the fact that we've become more connected than ever before with the internet and with how quickly we can reach each other, that yet we're in some ways more divided than ever. It's easier than ever to just find our groups and just stay in them. And obviously those are very unfortunate things that you and I are both working to fix. So let's dive more into the book then, which you can buy on, and I'll have links in the show notes for this, that you can buy Amazon, or buy the book on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and hardback or hardcover format. And get so let's get more into its actual insights. One of the big issues confronting constructive discussions is, and just talked about a little bit a moment ago, is that some people just don't have any interest in them. So, how can we make civility or constructive dialogue appealing to those who don't actively seek it out?
That I saw as one of the sort of critical drivers of this book, and one of the ways that I hope to distinguish it and go beyond what traditional bridging approaches or calls for civility have been able to do, which is that this is not a call for civility for the sake of civility. This is not saying, hey, let's not fight about this. It's not worth fighting about this when it comes to political issues, because I think, to your point, that is a really hard case to make. And I wouldn't agree with that. I see the stakes are huge. Like, there are legitimately, you know, really critical political problems that would be worth fighting over if the fighting accomplished anything. But that's the thing, is making the case that this civil discourse, this healthy conversation as a means to getting your voice heard, as a means to working toward a problem solving approach and working together towards a problem solving approach, is much more effective at approaching these issues, at dealing with these issues, than any kind of fighting, yelling, whatever it is that may be justified in and of itself. That stuff doesn't work. And that is, I think, the critical case for civility and the critical case for constructive dialogue that needs to be made is, look, if you want to make your voice heard, if you want to make an impact on the issues, if you want to persuade others and encourage them to consider the points that you have to share, this is the best way to do that. And that's been, by and large, the approach with the book. So.
Yeah, you make a great point. These are very critical issues, and I think sometimes, and in this, I'm going to include myself in this too, because obviously these are always ways that every one of us can improve. Is just this whole, when we try to tell people to be civil. It's like, it doesn't mean you can't fight over it. And because of how critical these issues are, sometimes we make it more of an existential crisis than it actually is. But because these issues are so important, we don't, or we shouldn't expect people to not fight about them. But it's to the point, obviously, people just take it overboard, and it's, no, we can fight about this, but we need to still be willing to hear each other out about this, make sure that we at least gives other people a chance, because we don't have all the answers. But you're never gonna, I mean, I have things that I feel strongly about too, and we're not going to be able to just sit there and not say anything about them. And some people try to make a clear distinction between civility and politeness. Not really. The politeness part, I mean, every one of us falls into we're being impolite towards other people at some point. But civility is about, you can disagree, sometimes vehemently, but you have to be willing to hear other people out and at least try to see their point of view. And that's one of the big things I think sometimes our movement doesn't quite make clear is, no, you can fight for what you believe in, but there has to be a point where you scale it back and are not willing to, for example, inflict political violence on people or physical violence on people because of politics.
Well,
So
yeah, and I think the more critical point to make is that stuff doesn't work, ultimately.
yeah,
It doesn't lead us anywhere positive. It doesn't lead those people inflicting the violence any closer to their real goal or the things they actually care about.
right.
It is perpetuating the conflict. And oftentimes it undermines your cause, undermines your side, and plays into this game of optics that can be very much unfavorable while also perpetuating the conflict ad infinitum. And
Yeah,
yeah, the common ground, I think you touched on it there as far as, no, we need to be able to disagree. When I talk about common ground in the book, I'm not talking about the things we agree on. I'm talking about us being able to have more of a common language to understand that we have shared goals and shared purpose underlying all our disagreement. It's our disagreement that makes the conversation worthwhile. It's our disagreement that makes it so that we can learn from others, we can gain from others in the conversation, and we can refine our ideas, complement each other's ideas. And this is something that I think is very valuable to explore, that two perspectives on a given issue don't need to be in conflict with one another. They both inform the problem. If you take a look at, for example, look, there is an economic issue, and you're seeing way too much power in the hands of corporations. To say that corporations, given too much power, can use that power, can abuse that power at the detriment of the common people, at the detriment of society, at the detriment of free enterprise, yeah, that's true. And to say that government regulation and over-regulation can ultimately come in excess and lead to the detriment of the free enterprise, healthy economies, the consumer. That's true too. All of that informs the solution. All of that adds to us being able to solve the problem and to understand the complexities of the problem. But it's because these issues are so deeply complex, and because we need to account for all these different perspectives, this is why we gain from each other. This is why we gain from the conversation itself. And to your point, that sense of, well, we have to listen to others, it should not come, and I think it cannot sustainably come out of a sense of moral obligation. Instead, what I encourage readers to realize within the book, it's a golden rule application, which is, if you want people to open their minds to what it is you have to say, the most effective thing you can do is to open your mind to what it is they have to say. And starting by listening, starting by giving them space to share their ideas, and having that curiosity, realizing that you can gain from learning and hearing those, that leads you much more often than people will expect, much more often than people might expect, to a situation where suddenly things sort of quiet down, calm down, and the person who might be ranting at the start will turn to you and say, well, what do you think? And that's where you can have this ground for healthier conversation and more productive conversation.
Yeah, I definitely can't argue with any of that. I think it goes back to that the whole this is a big thing with me, and I try to practice what I preach as much as possible. Is just this
Sure.
level of self awareness that people need to have about themselves. A lot of times they think, "Boy, that other side is so uncompromising. They don't listen to me," and I just they're just so bigoted and but like, okay, but are you doing the same thing? 'Cause a lot of times you are, but sometimes it's hard to get people to realize that, or even if they do realize that, they're still going to dig in and be like, nope, nope, I've got it all figured out. And then obviously that just that keeps us from going anywhere. But I don't
Yeah,
want to spend.
and
Oh, you go ahead.
there's so much, like, just to hop on that briefly, there is so much of they started it, they're just as bad,
Yeah,
or they're not being civil.
they're
Yep.
worse.
Sure. And you can justify all this. You're not going to really argue with the justification, and I don't bother arguing with the justification. You may be justified in a more hostile approach. That doesn't mean it works. That doesn't
Right.
mean it's effective. And that is what I'm more focused on with the book, is
Okay,
finding that more effective pathway.
got it. That makes sense. So let's get a little bit more into this actually
Yeah.
interacting with people. Is in your view, is it really possible to have a civil conversation with anyone? And where and how does one draw that line?
Uh, Short answer is no. Um, in the short term, certainly, place matters a lot. All of these tools for healthier conversation are a little more focused on interpersonal, uh, in person conversations with people we know somewhat. And so and this is where it really starts, I think, for most people, is talking to friends, talking to relatives that you have differences with. On social media, this doesn't work
Yeah.
because there's that impersonality, and people are just there for brief times. You don't know who's real to start, and you don't know why they're there.
Most of
So
them being keyboard warriors anyways.
keyboard warriors, it's very hard to have that kind of empathy and human connection underlying those conversations. You can do it to a degree, but it's just going to be a lot harder there. As far as in person, look, there are going to be people where it's going to take some time, and some people may struggle to turn. Now, one of the techniques, one of the cool approaches that I share within the book is you can kind of take the approach that I take, to the reader, which is I want to give you tools for persuasion. I want to help you reach other people. And so you can apply that to the conversations you have, insofar as if you're hearing something that is really dissonant, that is way out there, rather than try to attack, well, that's wrong, you can make the appeal that whoever is espousing those ideas is going to have a harder time reaching the audience they want to reach. And when you have that handout of, look, I want to share this power of persuasion with you, I want you to be able to engage in conversation and share your ideas more effectively, suddenly you can get a conversation to take on a much less hostile tone, to be more collaborative. You want to learn from each other. And half the book is about mindset. Half the book is about creating that initial motivation because it has to be authentic. All that said, look, there are going to be people who are reticent, who may have issues with the trust necessary, who may have issues with their mental health that have been exacerbated by politics. We all know that that is a phenomenon that is, tragically more and more common these days. And you may have issues as well where they're very hot buttons and to be able to talk about them constructively with someone or get someone to accept any kind of conversation or any kind of seemingly critical feedback on their ideas around a given issue will take a lot of time. And, it comes down to how much time you have. But one of the things that I do touch on, if it's not everyone, if it's just a few people in your life that you can mend relationships with, that you can build bridges with through these techniques, that is still a huge change. That is still very much a positive, and that can spread. And while I can't promise you'll reach everyone, you will reach. And I think for a lot of the listeners who may be more used to this hyper-polarized idea of the political realm, you'll reach a lot more people than you expect.
It's all about those baby steps, right? And I could be an impatient person and want to
For sure.
jump parts of the process and just get to the end. But I mean, it's true. You do have to take a little bit of the baby steps first to actually get to where we're going. A lot of times, this whole talk about building common ground, it can, for lack of a better term, can get very woo-woo, very highfalutin, idealistic, and a lot of times doesn't really get to the actionable steps. But that's a much more actionable way of looking at things. So I can really appreciate that and try to that's the whole thing, is not just trying to bridge these knowledge gaps for people with this podcast and with all the other work I do, but give people actionable steps which they can take to actually improve civic and political discourse in their lives and in the lives of people around them. So you can definitely appreciate that point of view. So talked about this a little bit ago, one of the first questions, or you talked about it in one of your answers to the first questions, and that's constructive dialogue often isn't conducive to winning elections, which is why some candidates avoid it or at least limit healthy discourse. Now, when they get into office, maybe they have to be a little bit more compromising or hearing people out than they would like, although even then a lot of people don't do that. So how do we make constructive dialogue succeed in elections? What would that take in your view?
Well, going back to the initial crux of the problem, as I saw it, and one of the inspirations for the book is we're used to hearing about politics in this divisive way. We're used to hearing politics talked about in this divisive way because it works for politicians in the short term. The thing is, if you want to change that, you have to really get at the incentives within our political structure. And as much as we may be discouraged by all the division, all the rhetoric that we hear from politicians, people tend to have a bit of a defeatist mindset around it. It's like, oh, it just keeps getting worse. It keeps getting worse. There's nothing we can do about it. This creates market opportunities. The approval rates for Congress as a whole, to give an important example, are whatever the opposite of through the roof is. Uh, Under the basement,
Yeah, it's
um,
abysmal.
abysmal, exactly. And within that, there is market opportunity. There is a way to sort of tap in to the hunger that people have and the frustration people have, because all this hyper divisive politics, just like it makes it impossible for us to make any progress with each other, it is not conducive to actual problem solving. And there is a huge need for actual problem solving. So one of the big things I call for in the book is, ultimately, if you want to see this societal change, the bridging ethos goes hand in hand with empowering new voices within the political arena. I obviously had my experience with Forward, and there are some minor party or PACs that try to create these vehicles. But the pathway just to independent success in the political arena is much, much clearer, actually, I would say, than people assume it to be. And the big examples that I'd point to, and I encourage your feedback as someone who's been in this independent space or this third party space, 2022 Utah senatorial election, Evan McMullin ran, garnered about 44% of the vote. That would be insane for a third party. He wasn't a third party. The independents were a second party. It was a sole alternative in a very red state where he created a viable alternative. Sorry, I'm restating myself, to the incumbent power. 2024, Dan Osborne running in Nebraska, 47 to 48% of the popular vote, running against a lone Republican. What I said in Florida, when people would have their doubts about Forward trying to do whatever it was doing, does Florida really need a third party? No, Florida needs a second party. A lot of places need a second party. And this pathway, created in some part by our natural division and created in some part by gerrymandering, that's exacerbated it in a lot of congressional districts and a lot of things at lower levels, at state and municipal levels. Well, I guess more state levels, but all of these things create a pathway to independents challenging major party incumbents. And what that ultimately leads to, if you have a positive ethos that is shining through even just a few successful independent efforts, suddenly you can change the complexion of the system. Suddenly you can go from a zero-sum perpetual tug of war to a fulcrum of a small base enough to deny either party a majority within a given legislative body, the US Congress being, of course, the holy grail of that. And within that kind of structure, the incentives do fundamentally change. You cannot continue to just cater to this divisive negative politicking when there's another alternative in play. If you were trying to say the Democrats being in power is your main calling card, Trump being in power and MAGA being in power is your main appeal to voters, suddenly there's an alternative. Suddenly that doesn't work as well. And suddenly, instead of just strong arming when we have power and trying to perpetuate the conflict, we are forced into a position where we have to work together to actually solve problems. And we find ourselves, and this is not to destroy the parties, this is to liberate the parties from these current incentives, because those perspectives, those liberal and conservative perspectives, are so valuable to the actual problem solving. And that conversation, that additive conversation where we're working together to solve the problem, can start to happen as you can break through and shift those incentives. And I think the best pathway there is with candidates who exemplify that ethos. The one thing I'll also add to that ethos of better politics is not in itself a worthwhile appeal to voters. Ultimately, you have to make the case that doing politics better, talking about politics more constructively, leads to better solutions. And it's those solutions that are going to be the calling card of successful campaigns. It's the way you think about issues, because you never want to put people in a position. I mean, this is the failure, I think, of civility efforts in the past. You don't want to put civility against the issues. You don't want to depend on people caring more about the politician being nice than the politician stands on abortion, immigration, various wars, this or that, the economy. You have to show that your manner of doing politics leads you to better ideas, to better solutions on those big issues that matter to people. And that's where I see the real heart of the opportunity for new voices to arise and break through the division and shift our incentives. Sorry, that was quite long.
No, you're good. Whatever you need to answer the question. I will say you kind of, I guess you kind of answered this question already, because I was just thinking about it towards the beginning of that answer, because you brought up Congress and its abysmal rating. And that kind of goes back to what we call Fenno's paradox. For people at home who don't know, Fenno's paradox is people hate Congress but love their congressperson, basically. People think that their congressperson is not the reason that Congress sucks. So they keep reelecting them at astronomically high rates, despite the fact everybody hates Congress. So, for you, Nathan, how I guess that answer kind of already got to it, but I'll ask it anyways. How do we use this whole common ground constructive dialogue framework to break that kind of Fennos paradox where even though people hate Congress and want to see it change, but they still re-elect their congressperson? So how do we use this constructive dialogue framework to try to fix
I
that, for
don't,
lack of a better term?
I don't know, and you can correct me on this. I don't know if they necessarily love their congressperson in very large numbers, so much as the appeal of the other side winning. First of all, there's not really a viable alternative. And that appeal of, hey, at least the Democrats aren't in charge, or hey, at least the Republicans aren't in charge, is very powerful, is very effective.
There is that too, yeah.
Again, empowering independent voices, just these positive alternatives, goes a huge, huge way. And you don't need all of them. Once again, you can have a lot of popular incumbents who aren't getting challenged, and it's still fine if you can break through and build that fulcrum of just a handful of independents or independent minded politicians, at least constructive dialogue minded politicians, although it's harder within the incentives of the party structure. If you can put them in positions to succeed, that is enough to fundamentally change the incentives and change the political game, as it were. So it doesn't have to be about challenging everyone, but I do think a part of the appeal of creating a viable independent pathway and showing people, hey, this can work, is having a mechanism of real competition in more areas than we have it now.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that kind of goes back to some of the independence strategists thinking about, well, who do you run? Where do you run independence? Do you run in a place where there is really only one party and try to challenge them and bring independence and the minority party in, or do you do it in a place where there's two parties that are competing strongly against each other? And I mean that's a bit of a whole other can of worms, uh, but if you've got something to add, though, you can.
I mean, yeah, I think my point has been, I'm certainly on the former side as far as at least short to medium term viability is. You want to create voter choice. You want to create competition in a lot of areas that are lacking for competition. I go back to the sort of the defeatist view we have of politics as a whole and the divisive nature of it. And what you can realize is there's market opportunity there. There's market opportunity for, you know, credible alternatives, for actual problem solving. And as I've analyzed the problem and as I've worked with candidates in the past and seen successes and failures, that seems to me like the most viable path. But yeah, obviously it's an old question, and just like anything else, a variety of ideas and approaches and perspectives is valuable to finding the best answer.
Right. So I probably should have actually asked this towards the beginning.
Sure.
Probably would have made more sense to it, but it's okay. We're here now. So I've had guests in the past that have, and either whether I've asked them directly or they've just brought it up, they've proposed different points in the past as to when our fracturing started, and I have my own opinions about that too. But where do you believe it began, and are there encouraging signs to you as to how this fracturing can be fixed, or I should say, what are the encouraging signs that you've seen?
As far as where it started, people have a tendency to frame it as who started it, which I think compounds the problem because we play this blame game. Wherever it started, and it's a little blurry, the fact is it kept going and it kept growing because it works. So you can go back in the 1950s, there was some sort of, oh God, I forget the name of the group, but there was actually a study done that said our parties are way too close together.
American
on
Political Science Association.
that's what it was. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they
Toward a more
recommended,
responsible two-party system. It was the
yes,
name of the
yes.
report.
Yes. The more responsible two-party system is, hey, let's divide the parties more clearly. So that started over decades. And you saw a little, in the Reagan era, you saw a little more lean towards the jabs at each other and the jabs at the opposite party. And it's still playful. It's still, we're, at the end of the day, we're all friends. And that was understood. Gingrich and the Republican Revolution in 94, that is a big, not a turning point, an acceleration point. Um, and I think it's very fair for people to point to that, where he identified, look, most of my supporters are listening to me through this burgeoning conservative talk radio. I don't need to play so much to the general audience. I need to play to my base. This is where I can gain the most ground. And lo and behold, Republicans shattered all their fundraising records within that year. And I don't put that much blame on that, because by the next cycle, the Democrats had shattered all their fundraising records and were emulating the same strategies. And this works more and more and more as we become more siloed and more fractured by our communications infrastructure. Which is not to say that social media was created to divide us. Social media was created as a tool to make money and that people would be interested in. And we are. It's exciting for us. But one of the byproducts of it is it silos us and it creates these little bubbles. And the best way to cater to that kind of communications paradigm is by playing to the bubbles, is by riling up and energizing these rather alienated groups of people rather than reaching out, because there's no general audience to speak to. There's nowhere you can speak to the general audience. So, as far as where it goes from here, the encouraging sign is there's a lot of fatigue from that. And I think what you see in rising independent registration numbers among the younger generations, a lot of that is a big signifier of people, especially young people, being really tired of just the constant partisan tug of war, the constant insanity, which as, and this is a perspective that I've been rather blessed to have over my life. If you're a little outside of that, you just see how senseless it is and see how unproductive it is. At the same time, while there are those positive signs and positive opportunities, this is a powder keg, and this is a divided environment where inflammatory acts, inflammatory rhetoric can heighten the tension and can create hot conflict at times that is very dangerous, and that sometimes makes the division, at least for bursts, much stronger. So that is, while we may have positive signs, it doesn't mean we're out of the woods anywhere close to yet.
Definitely true. Definitely true. Yeah, that's. I think there's a good point of trying to, when you try to pinpoint where this fracturing, this polarization began. I mean, really, American history has kind of had ebbs and flows of that. I mean, Civil War, obviously, the
Yeah.
height of it, but yeah, to your point about, yeah, it's sometimes that could be unhelpful to be like, well, where did it start? Because then people are trying to pinpoint, oh, it was this specific group, and even if one specific group started it, another group carrying it on and then going back and forth, that doesn't justify it. So, so definitely good points there. So, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I kind of wanted to save it for this part. So, morality, or at least what we view as moral, is inevitably going to be part of our political views. We all have very strong opinions about, well, or a lot of us have strong opinions about what is just, but oftentimes it goes too far. And on a couple of previous episodes of the podcast, I talked about how moralized attitudes and people believing they are championing what's just can lead to a stubbornness and anger at others, oftentimes very excessively. So, how can we take a constructive or collaborative approach to talking about moral issues, or at least issues in a moral sense?
So it is a tricky area, and it is naturally something where I will have the most feedback and the most, not necessarily doubt, but people have a hard time imagining at times that you can have a constructive conversation around a topic like whatever gender issues, abortion, um, a lot of issues where there's a little more of a moral undercurrent of the sentiment. And it comes down to a few things. I think, first of all, when you are basing your line of argument on your own morality, and this is that whole riling up over reaching out, this is how it um, it transpires. This is how it manifests, is these moral declaratives as political arguments. If you say something like healthcare is a human right, life begins at conception, these are not statements that can gain any ground as far as persuasion. They're just moral declarations. All they're really doing, and this is what we've become so used to hearing, they just show what team you're on. And if someone isn't already inclined to agree with your moral underpinning, that's frustrating. That can certainly be frustrating. But just restating your moral assertion tends not to be a very good way to move them. What I talk about within the book is you can kind of step away from your morality and talk about the sort of moral outcry as a practical concern for the society and as a practical consideration for the issue. Insofar as, look, if you have a given policy in place on abortion, that is going to create a moral outcry. That is something that not only you, but millions of people are going to say that is objectionable. That is not okay. And what are the outcomes of that? There is going to be a lot of distress, a lot of unrest, a lot of reaction, and they're going to try to respond in their own way. So having that lens of stepping outside yourself and talking about morality as a societal consideration, um, and then B, sort of getting to that policy level rather than the philosophical level of talking about the issues, lends itself much more to a constructive conversation, lends itself much more to people realizing, okay, well, if I understand this perspective and I understand this sentiment, that informs how I can understand possible solutions and possible ways that policy is going to uh, be potentially realized, and the challenges, the obstacles that it may face. And that allows us, even on these issues where we might think, because we're so used to the "if I ruled the world" line of thinking when we talk about our own beliefs, um, that is something that lends itself much more to, oh, you can have a conversation and learn about this, even without changing your moral assertions. So,
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's how do you ground the moral in the more practical solutions? That's the big thing, is because when you have a certain moral view and you feel strongly about it, it's going to be hard for you to change it if you have somebody who has a different moral compass
and
to try to change that.
yeah, and then you're asking a lot of yourself if you're making a purely moral appeal.
Yeah.
Is, you need to get someone to change their philosophy about life. You need to get someone to change their ideology or their religion in order to agree with you. That is a tall order. People will not do that, and you can gain a lot more ground and get people to understand where you're coming from more effectively by stepping outside of "I believe this because of my morals" to that more societal and more policy lens.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I always like to emphasize for all my listeners how content from my guests and myself are applicable and useful for people across the political spectrum. Don't want to just teach them, want to be able to have them give them actionable info. So this divide I'm going to be talking about, though, is a little bit different. This book is ostensibly aimed at people who don't typically look for common ground or think it isn't there, but might be like, oh, okay, I guess I can do this. But what about people who think they seek common ground already, but don't truly do that or aren't as open-minded as they think they are? What would you say to them specifically to get them to realize, hey, this is actually is something that you need to change about your viewpoint?
Well, I mean, what everyone needs to change may vary. I certainly don't know all of my readers and all of their needs, but um, the case I would make is, hey, it's a tool set. It's a lot of things that could help you, and approaching it with an open mind, just like approaching conversation with an open mind, can be to your benefit. Allows you to learn more, allows you to expand. One general thing I will point to is just the need for that intellectual humility in conversation. Assuming and assuming you have all the answers, whether it's about the issue or about how you handle the issue, lends lends itself to um to some pride that cometh sometimes before falls.
Yeah.
And it can create a weakness. It can make it harder for you to see your weaknesses. So my biggest lesson, one of my biggest uh, things that I echo throughout the book is, before you engage in healthy conversation, it's about wanting to learn from other perspectives. It's be curious. That is so incredibly helpful in engaging in healthy political discussion, in developing your own ideas. And I would hope that prospective readers take on the same approach uh, with the book, which is just to be curious. To the earlier part of that question, as far as who it's aimed at, um, I think that was one of the interesting challenges for me, because I also tried to be cognizant that a lot of my audience and my initial audience is people who are interested in a common ground approach, ostensibly, is people who are closer to the bridging space or the political innovation space and looking to build within that. And for them, I really wanted to have something that is not only interesting and valuable and gives them tools to directly pass on, but to create a book that they could share with those in their lives who really need more of that common ground mentality, who really need more of that constructive dialogue approach. And it's a bit of a cliche to say the book is for everyone, but its functionality, its effectiveness comes down in great part to the width and the breadth of the appeal.
Yeah, that intellectual humility, that's such a big thing. Sometimes if I'm doing a podcast, usually this applies to the ones that I'm where it's just me, but that intellectual humility, sometimes I think I've got something figured out, and sometimes I gotta push aside that, oh yeah, I've already got this figured out. And sometimes I gotta be like, well, maybe there's something I forgot, or maybe there's an angle I never thought about. And then I'll find something that I had originally thought, and I find something different. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Now, sometimes, sometimes I still got to make sure that I'm, you know, not having any level of hubris, because sometimes I gotta. I mean, you always gotta check yourself, right? But that,
Yeah.
yeah, that's. Go ahead.
Well, one thing to that, this is, a group that we tend to focus a lot on. We can empathize with quite a bit because we work in the political space and we think a lot and talk a lot about politics. Is this lack of intellectual humility as risk? There's a big audience, and there is a huge population out there that has the opposite problem, where they have the intellectual humility. They see themselves not knowing anything about politics, and it intimidates them, and they lack the confidence in their voice. And I think the humility and confidence go hand in hand. Some of us have no shortage of the confidence, and we need to work on the humility. But at the same time, there are so many people out there who may not realize that if you just have doubts, if things confuse you about a political issue and an approach to a political issue, sharing those doubts, sharing your concerns and your perspective is really valuable to the conversation. It informs the person you're talking with about, you know, maybe weaknesses in their appeal, maybe challenges that they may not have thought of. And having that confidence in your voice, that confidence that you can add positively to the conversation just by taking part with an open mind. I think that is also really valuable for so many people who are politically inactive, who are silent, and who we could really benefit from hearing more of in our political discourse.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And some of those people, I touched on them a little bit in an episode I did before my 50th episode I did about
Mm,
political apathy. Some people are
sure.
apathetic, not just because they don't care, they want to care, but they just think that this is just too much for me. The divisiveness is too much, or like you said, I don't really know what's going on. I can't understand it. And those of us who are in the civic arena and the bridge building arena, that's one of the big challenges, but one we got to continue to refine. So, the penultimate question here before I get to
Yes.
the random, fun, non political question of the day. Any final thoughts on Common Ground or your book that you want to share?
I think I've shared quite a bit of it. Again, it's a book about the tools for better dialogue, the mindsets and frameworks and conversational techniques that you can use, and then how those can lead to both self improvement and to societal betterment as we apply them at scale. And at the end of the day, this is something that I talked about with independence and the messaging and just being able to talk about the issues when you present yourself as a more positive ethos, when you present yourself as a common ground, a bridge builder. The proof is in the pudding. And ultimately, the value uh, of this book really comes through if you are able to succeed with the techniques, if you are able to take on some of these ideas and reach people you wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise, if you are able to work towards solutions and work towards ideas that you couldn't have produced um, from standard partisan thinking. All of that is making the case for bridging far better than any kind of moral appeal to bridging. And the more that we can show, hey, constructive dialogue leads to more effective communicating, leads to us feeling more heard, leads to better solutions to real problems, I think the more clear it becomes that however justified fighting may be, this is the better way to do things.
Nice, nice. Yep. Just like we have been talking about in this episode, a lot of actionable tips in that book, not just very highfalutin idealistic stuff. So, and of course, I'll
Yeah,
like I said before, I'll put the links to the book in the show notes for you at home to or wherever you're listening to this to pick it up on Amazon, ebook, paperback, and hardcover format. So, now we move on to the final question of the day. For those of you who are new to the podcast, at the end of guest episodes, I like to pose random questions of the day that are fun, non political, just to get a little bit of a different side of the guest, just because variety is the spice of life after all. So, Nathan, today's random question of the day for you is what is a common phrase that you think is annoying and should stop being used, even if it irrationally bothers you?
whew. Um, oh boy. I have so many. I'm just so positive when it comes to phrases. There are a few that I love. One thing, one that comes to mind that's just always funny is "with all due respect," and that's
Yeah.
one. But it
No offense,
amuses
but
me. No offense, but uh, you know, the one that grinds my gears when I hear it is not trying to be a jerk or variations thereof.
oh yeah.
It's that one is just nothing good is going to come out of this, and it's almost braggadocious. It's
Yeah.
like, well, I don't even have to try to be a jerk. It's
Yeah.
um and
I probably used
yeah,
that
that
phrase before, but
hmm?
I probably used that phrase before, but that's
No, no,
now that
no,
you
no,
bring
no.
it up.
And it can come from a positive place, which is I
Right.
don't mean any of this maliciously. Same can be said of with all due respect. Um, but we have it actually speaks to a deeper challenge. Oh dang, I don't know if this even veers enough off course of the book because it's a deeper challenge of how we criticize and how we deal with like offering critical feedback to each other when we're used to this notion of politeness. Um, but yeah, that's fascinating to me, and that particular one I think is not the smoothest. Well, what are your some that
So,
bother you?
so, so unlike you, I'm very good about being bothered by innocuous things that don't
Oh,
actually
please.
matter. Funny enough, the political stuff, I'm actually in some ways better about,
Sure, yeah.
being more even keeled about that. Not always, but I find there's a little bit of catharsis I find in getting upset about things that I know don't ultimately matter but are still bothersome. So for me, one of the many phrases that bothers me is "give me 110%." I hate that phrase. That is so annoying. I heard it plenty of times when I played football in high school. Whenever I coached the YMCA, I never tell my kids that, just because one, it's mathematically impossible. You can't give 110%. Otherwise, that is 100%. And B, it's it's also like there's a certain undercurrent or hidden meaning. I can't think of the word, but you're basically implying to people that you want them to overexert themselves, and that's not what you're trying to do. You want them to give you full effort, but overexert themselves. That's how you actually get hurt. That's how you get injured, and that again, really not important in the grand scheme of things. But I find it incredibly annoying. Give me
No, no, no.
110%.
I mean, I think you touch on like the actual practical outcome of it, which is,
Yeah,
there's this idealization we have of pushing beyond our limits. And there are so
yeah,
many TV shows and works of fiction that dramatize and romanticize this. And, to to your point or to their credit, like there are great athletes who talk about this, but it is also the thing that leads you to breaking something to when your body is telling you to stop. That is often a very good sign to stop. But you do
yeah.
remind me, one of my I always had this minor dream of being able to speak to, a student athlete related audience, um, and use the line, being a great athlete is about giving 110%, to your sport. Being a great student athlete is about knowing how to manage the other negative 10%.
Oh, okay. Nice. That's it.
So,
Interesting. I've never heard it put like that before. I like that. And there is something to the whole like, hey, you're more capable. You're capable of more than you think you are. That's great. I tell my kids
sure,
whether
yeah.
it's football, basketball, soccer, volleyball, kickball. I will tell them something along those lines. But I will never tell them to, especially because these are kids. I'm not going to tell them to
Oh, yeah.
overexert themselves.
And managing the other negative 10% also makes less and less sense the more you think about it.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm just
it's true. But I do like that better than just give me 110%.
then
But
just giving 110.
but
Yeah.
like I said, really not important in the grand scheme of things. Still find a way to bother me. I think it's partly also just I try to find things that actually aren't important to get annoyed at, so I'm not so frustrated at things that are actually important.
I'm the
Maybe
same
I don't.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it's fun. You have to, and actually I talk about this, to go back briefly to the book, this sort of this sports mentality around politics, and when it becomes this thing, I'm all for the sports mentality around sports. I love,
Yeah.
that, and yeah, it can be very fun, and we have to
Oh yeah.
recognize, when these sort of mindsets are attempting, like, what is the positive here? And there is, people want to let their emotions out and just argue about stuff. And yeah, it's so much fun to argue about the meaningless stuff rather than,
Yeah.
this stuff that's going to ruin relationships or this or that.
Exactly. Although some people can also take
Oh,
the sports
absolutely.
thing too far, obviously.
Oh,
And I mean,
Hundred.
I get a little heated about teams that I hate more more than I should,
Sure, yeah.
but as much as we can keep this going on
Please,
and
yeah.
on, we do got to wrap things up. So for all of you at home, thank you so much for listening and watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And obviously, again, put the link to Nathan's book in the show notes. Please go ahead and buy that. Any other links you want to share first, Nathan?
You can find me. So my website is nathansmolensky.com. You can also find me. I post every so often on LinkedIn. You can follow me there. I do have a Facebook author page. I need to use that more. And in general, my website is the best place to reach out to me. I do events, I do speaking. So if you have any ideas for collaboration, I love to hear those. So yeah,
Perfect.
definitely get in touch.
All right. I'll make sure to put those in the show notes as well. So for me, I also have a Facebook page for my author stuff. Well, all my stuff I do, but including the author stuff. So Paul Rader, author and speaker. My LinkedIn, I post on there quite frequently. My medium.com profile, my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively mitigate political polarization. My website, paulrader.org. And my book that I also wrote, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections, How They Become More Competitive. Not trying to argue that they should or shouldn't. It's just saying this is the issues they face. Here's how some actionable steps that they can take to fix them. But that is going to wrap things up for today. So as always, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.